Welcome everybody to the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks and the sixth in our special 8-part series on Vashon 101. A reminder, as you probably can see, your microphone is muted for the talk. Please put your questions in the chat function, and we'll be answering questions during the Q&A at the end of the presentation, and that'll be moderated by Chris Austin. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Bruce Holman, who will be speaking on Vashon history, first contact to present-day Vashon. So you're in the right place if you wanted to hear that this evening. I'm Elsa Kronquist, the Executive Director. Could you please move to the next slide, Chris? This is a good test if Chris can move to the next slide.
I'm on it.
Oh, good. Thank you, Chris. So I am Elsa Kronquist still, the Executive Director of the Vashon Heritage Museum, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors for this evening's talk. Thank you to For Culture very, very much, and Humanities Washington. These talks would not be possible without their support and your support, everybody who's out there. Thank you. Now at this time, Chris Austin, would you please read the land acknowledgement statement? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Elsa. The Vashon Heritage Museum stands on the ancestral lands of the Shwabopes or Swiftwater people who inhabited Vashon Maury Island for millennia. The Donation Land Claim Act encouraged large numbers of Euro-American settlers to claim this land, even before the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 extinguished native claims to it. The Shwabopes were forcibly removed and relocated onto nearby reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. We acknowledge the people of the Puyallup tribe whose stewardship of and relationship with Vashon Maury Island continues today. We commit to amplify the voices of Indigenous people, making space for them to tell their own story, both past and present, in our exhibits and programs. Thank you, Elsa.
Thank you, Chris. So the next slide, thank you. I'll read our inclusion pledge. The Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. So let's see. So tonight's presentation is the sixth in this very popular series. Because of the interest in Vashon, we'll be updating and expanding this series so that we can present it again in 2025. But until 2025, please join us next month on July 13th when Alice Larson will present on Vashon Demographics, a picture of us. And now I'd like to introduce Chris Austin again with the next slide, who will present this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Elsa. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a man who basically invented history, Dr. Bruce Holman, who has a PhD of history from the University of Washington. He currently is the president and guiding force for the Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum and a good friend. So take it away, Bruce.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Let me share my screen here. All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Elsa. What I want to do tonight is I want to emphasize first, and Brandon Raynon last month with the presentation on the Shwabopes or Swiftwater people of Vashon Island emphasized this as well. That this is a history, not the history of Vashon Island. History is always a conversation, if you will, a conversation between historians, with historians and the public and public interested in history. And we're constantly learning about our past. So what we thought was true and accurate, 10 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, gets re-examined. New information comes up, and history is always a process of sort of revising our understanding of the past. So this is my version of Vashon's history, and it's informed by years of work and years of research and writing. And you see 2 books that I've done. One, the first with Gene Finley, Vashon Maury Island, Images of America, done in 2011, and then A Brief History of Vashon Island, published in 2016. And so those are already getting on 10 years old. So it's time to sort of look back and revise and bring in new information. And I'll do that a bit tonight. And I also wanted to give a sort of a tip of the hat to Vashon 101. We first did Vashon 101 in 2006. And it was really that collaboration with fellow scholars and of Vashon Island that led to both of these books and both of these publications. And revising Vashon 101 has just been a joy. I think all of us who have been involved in it have really enjoyed it. And it really has helped us to understand the island more deeply as we look at it through the multiple perspectives that each of us bring from our disciplines. So what I want to do tonight is, let me see how I can move slides. There we go. What I want to do tonight is I want to do a review of what we're doing with the permanent exhibit at the museum. As many of you know, we are in the midst of revising and updating the permanent exhibit at the museum. And we're trying to do it in a way that tells a comprehensive sort of history of Vashon Island that looks at all aspects of our past. And so I want to use that as a mechanism and sort of take you through what we're thinking about at this point. And it would be helpful if any of you are interested in getting involved, or interested in looking at these plans and looking at the text that we're developing and the concepts. More than happy to have you get involved. We will be completing a brief, if you will, of the exhibit here shortly, and getting it out to the public, getting it out to everyone. And so hopefully you can take part in that. So basically what we're doing is we're organizing the permanent exhibit chronologically. We've gone back and forth from thinking about, well, should we do it chronologically? Should we do it thematically? Should we do it around areas of the island? There's many ways to organize the story of Vashon, but we've come down on the side of organizing it by turning points and by what we're calling galleries at this point, or subject areas that look at particular time periods. And so the museum, as you walk into the museum, you'll enter it through a geology and natural history gallery. The first major turning point, of course, is the arrival of humans, and then the development of the Shwabop's people. The second turning point becomes contact in the 1770s to the 1790s, contact, and then following that, early settlement on the island. And then in the early 20th century, modernization, the arrival of the modern, automobiles, electricity, telephones, new ways of communicating, new ways of transportation. And of course, that results in a tremendous consolidation on the island. And then the turning point becomes World War II, which is significant in its own right, but really leads to Vashon becoming something very different than it was before the war. And that Vashon becomes a post-war suburban sort of area. And then in the 1990s to the present, essentially gentrification begins to change the island. And we see the emergence of contemporary Vashon. What the next turning points are, it's a little hard to know at this point. We may be at one. COVID may be one, we don't know at this point. But in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we'll have a better view of if there is a turning point that we're in the midst of right now, but can't quite fully see. So this is a real quick sort of a visual map of the museum. And as you see, you'll enter into the geology, You'll go past each of these turning points into these galleries. There'll be an interactive map at the back. The very back part of the museum will be rotating special exhibits. And then you'll come out through World War II gentrification and out to the present in Vashon Island. So it's just a way of sort of visually conceptualizing what I'm going to take you through. And again, as I also emphasized, if you have any questions as we go along, just put them in the chat. And then when we get to the end, we'll have time for a question and answer. Okay. So there's a lot of information on this slide. So take a deep breath, step back. And what I really want you to notice is when you look at census data, you're really looking at the data for the decade before. So when you look at the 1910 census, 2,423 people on the island, that's really the number there that came between the 944 in 1900 and the 2,423 in 1910, a 150% growth rate, tremendous growth on the island. And if you look at the very top, the pre-contact estimates of 10 to 15,000 Shwabop's people on Vashon Island. And I'll come back to that, and I'll come back to each of these. But I think when you look at this, you can see that there are some times like the 1910s, 1900s to 1910, the 1920s to 1930, there's actually a drop in population on the island. And then following World War II, in the 1950s, 1940 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70, in 80 to 90, there's very substantial growth. The slowdown between 1970 and 1980 is the Boeing bust. And population drops a bit, but still 13%. And then if you look from 1990 on, the 2000, 2010, 2020 census, Vashon growth has slowed way, way down. And so I want to sort of take you through that and then sort of look at what this means for Vashon Island. And we'll be coming back to this data. So this is just a graphic display of it. And you can see that dramatic drop from pre-contact to early settlement, and then that slow growth and then rapid growth between 1900 and 1910, and then it sort of levels off, and then a very strong growth through the 1950s, 60s, 70s to the 80s, a sharp increase in the 80s, 1980s to 1990, and then that gradual sort of tapering off. And Alice Larson, next month, we'll talk about the demography of Vashon Island. She'll give us a better sense of what's happening in the last 20, 30 years on Vashon Island. So when you enter the museum, you'll enter in this geology and natural history gallery. And that's one of the things I love about Vashon 101 is that it has enabled us to work with Steve Bergman, who talked about the geology of Vashon in the very first Vashon 101 session, and with Tom DeVries and Bianca Perla, who talked about the ecology, the historic and contemporary ecology of the island. And they have provided just excellent materials and ways for us to organize that sort of first Vashon geology and natural history gallery. And then, of course, the turning point of the arrival of human beings. Hard to overemphasize how important that was and how transformative it was for Vashon. And of course, the arrival of native peoples, first nomadic hunters probably here anywhere from 10 to 12,000 years ago, certainly evidence of Clovis points on the island. And then evidence of Shwabop settlement as early as 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. So millennia of occupation of the island and habitation of the island by native people. And we were lucky enough to have Brandon Raynon be part of Vashon 101 and tell the story of the Shwabop people. And if you haven't had a chance to see that, it's online at the museum, and I heartily recommend you go to the museum website and watch that Brandon's presentation. We also had the honor of having Ben and McLeod talk about the fish wars of the 1970s and 1980s, and sort of that piece of Vashon history and that piece of Shwabop and Puyallup relationships with the island. So those are the things that will help inform that Shwabop's gallery. And this is a map that we worked with the Puyallup tribe to put together for the Natural Wonder exhibit. And you can see these green circles, that there's a number of habitation points around Quartermaster Harbor. And if you have a chance to see Brandon Raynon's presentation from last month, he has a map that the Puyallup tribe is working on that shows even more sites of inhabitation around Vashon Island. And they're all, and I think this is very significant, they're all around Quartermaster Harbor, and they're all focused south toward Tacoma. So the first major turning point we come to after the arrival of human beings is contact. And that's a very important sort of turning point for the island, and particularly for the native people of the island. And here you can see with this census data, that 10 to 12, maybe 15,000 people living around Quartermaster Harbor pre-contact in the 1770s. And then by the 1880s, when the first sort of American settlers arrive, you drop by over 1,000%, and then slowly it builds up, but still only less than 1,000 people by 1900. So let me take you through what as I said earlier, history is a conversation. And if I were doing this talk, pre-contact, pre-COVID, say, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said there were 2 eras of contact. But in working with Brandon and the Puyallup tribe, we've really come to realize that there was a contact before what I had traditionally called first contact, the British contact with Vancouver. And that's the contact with pandemics. European diseases came into the Salish Sea, over the mountains, up the coast, possibly from the Pacific, in a variety of ways. And so that very first contact was not with human beings, but with pathogens that were brought over land, brought by contact, brought by trade. But that was the first contact. And then, of course, in the 1780s, George Vancouver sails into Puget Sound and establishes a British presence. And that British presence is fairly minimal, if you will, for most of that time. There's basically about a 40, 50-year period in which the British are here, but they're not making a huge impact on the Pacific Northwest, except through the diseases that come with them. And then the third contact is the American contact in the 1840s. And that's the contact in which the Americans bring a very different attitude about owning the land and settling the land, displacing native people, whereas the British tended to be more of a mutualistic trade relationship. The third contact, the American contact, leads to treaties, to displacement, and to ultimately to the land being transferred to American settlers. So driving behind this, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time with this, but I think it would be helpful if you're interested to explore this concept of the doctrine of discovery. It was a European originated doctrine that sort of justified spiritually, politically, and legally the colonization and seizure of land. And it's an important mindset that these European voyagers and then European settlers and American settlers brought with them. And so worth taking some time to explore the concept of the doctrine of discovery. And interestingly enough, the Pope just recently, just within the last few months, repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And of course, the Catholic Church was one of the first primogenitors of this concept. And so it's interesting that as we look back at this concept, that now the Pope is beginning to reject that approach to colonization. Now, first contact and I want to take some time with this. Again, lots of figures, but if you'll notice the two columns in red, these are sort of known numbers. These are Indian agent censuses on Vashon Island. So they have the problem of any census data. They're certainly not totally accurate. They're all we have. They're probably undercounts, for a variety of reasons, but they do give us at least a point in time and a number to work with. And what I find interesting about this is this is kind of a Western sort of mathematical, rational way of looking at native population pre-contact. Puyallup tribe, Brandon Raynon, have come up with similar numbers going through oral histories and oral traditions. And it's sort of interesting to me that two very different ways of knowing can come up with numbers and with evidence that sort of support one another. So I find that very interesting and just very encouraging. So what I did here is, if you look at 1855, the census estimate of 33, and then 1839 census of 315. What I did is I started with that 33 number and then backed out through all these pandemics. These are the known major pandemics that swept through the Salish Sea in the years in which they appeared. And the estimate is anywhere from 1/2 to 1/3 of the native population dies in each wave of pandemic. And so if you take that 1/2 number, and then what I did for the middle numbers, I alternated 1/2, 1/3, 1/2, 1/3. And then for the third number, I did 1/3. And if you look up from that 33 and look at the 1780, what you get is a range of 33,000 to 5,000 inhabitants on Vashon Island, with 13,360 as the middle point, which is sort of a rational European way of calculating a number that is very similar to the number that the Puyallup tribe thinks lived on Vashon in pre-contact times. And so the pandemics, which are really the first contact, if you will, in the 1770s and 1780s, have a devastating impact on Native people. Over 99% of the Native people of Vashon Island die during these pandemics. Now, with that in place, then, and the American sort of ownership, if you will, of the Salish Sea, at least south of the Canadian border, as a result of treaties with the British, what you get is a period of settlement on Vashon Island from the 1860s to the 1890s. And a couple of things about it that I find fascinating. One is that the early settlement of Vashon Island is very focused to Tacoma, just as was the early Shobop settlements on Vashon Island were focused toward Tacoma and Gig Harbor and the tribal groups that they were related to there. Also, that there's a pioneer mindset that sort of dominates settler thinking. And it's the concept of sort of moving from a wilderness to civilization, from taming, that sort of concept of taming the wilderness, taming the wild, and turning it into something that's usable. And that's a very powerful mindset during this period of time. The third thing, of course, is that it's mainly resource extraction driven. The vast resources, natural resources that the Puget Sound region had at the time, and in many ways still have, although they're diminished significantly, really is what drove people here and what drove the early economy. And it's also important to me to remember that settlers come here, and it's we often have in the mind, well, they're out to create a new world. They're out to build a new place for themselves. And that's certainly a bit of the drive. But when they get here, it's all about recreating what they left behind. And so if you think about all of that, there's essentially what Carlos Fuentes calls the big four of resources: farming, of course, agriculture, fishing in Puget Sound, and not just salmon, but all the bottom fish and all the other forage fish and all all that kind of thing. Logging, and that's a great photograph of logging in Burton, and then mining. And we often think of mining as digging in the ground and sort of, gold mines and that kind of thing. But also mining for clay to make bricks becomes a very important part of early Vashon. And then there's also industries here, most notably the dry docks and the shipyards, but also small factories for dynamite and other kinds of things that were used daily by people on Vashon Island. So it's that sort of resource extractions driving it, but it's also bringing in other industries that help support that. The idea of cultural recreation, I mean, the very first thing settlers do is they establish schools. The second thing they do is they establish churches. And then they begin to establish organizations. I love this photograph of that's the 1892 Vashon Cornet Band. So enough veterans of the Civil War, enough people knew how to play cornets, and that's a fairly sizable group for a cornet band. And of course, what opens the Puget Sound, what opens the Salish Sea is the arrival of the railroads. In the 1880s, the first railroad arrives at Tacoma. About 5 years later, it arrives in Seattle. And the significance there is it takes a trip of months or across the prairies or down through Panama and up the coast or around Cape Horn. It takes that and it translates it into a 3 or 4 day journey. You get on a train in St. Louis or in Chicago or someplace in the Midwest, and 3 days later you get off a train and you're in Tacoma or in Seattle. And that opens the floodgates for people coming to Vashon. And then what Nan Chasen calls the water link is this whole idea of building the transportation link to get around the Salish Sea. And it was all water focused. Very difficult to build roads. The few roads that are built take tremendous energy to build and tremendous resources, whereas the water highway is there for easy access. And that's one reason why Vashon develops with communities around the waterfront at first. And then there's these 3 patterns that I think still help define Vashon today. You have Matthew Bridges, who comes in 1865, and Matthew is a logger. He takes up land, he buys land, he logs it, and then he sells it off and moves to another patch of land. And he also married a native woman. And so for Matthew, he gets written out of Vashon history largely. Because he was not a sort of farmer, he was not a settled sort of person, and he married a native person. And so it establishes that sort of working class Vashon, if you will, that doesn't often get featured in histories. You have Sam and Eliza Sherman, who are among the first sort of arrivals for farmers on Vashon Island. And this photograph shows them in front of Fort Necessity, a logging hut that they lived in for the first few months that they were here until they could build a house. And this is later in their life, but you can see that even when they came to Vashon, there was something here for them to build on. And of course, Salmon brings his skill as a blacksmith. He is a Civil War veteran, so he has a pension. So they become a very substantial sort of leading family on Vashon Island because they have the resources, they have the education, and they have the skills to be farmers. And then there's one of my favorite characters from this time, Matilda Jane Carmine, just an amazing woman. And really the precursor for all the strong, amazing women that we have on Vashon Island. Matilda Jane marries young in St. Louis, Missouri. Her husband is killed, and she moves into San Francisco, and she with her children and starts a career in San Francisco. She meets a man named Carmine, who is a Teamster in San Francisco. They get married. They have the opportunity to move to Seattle. So they move to Seattle, and he's killed in an accident. And then she marries a man named Redding, and has several sons named Redding, and that's Redding's Beach. But Matilda Jane buys land on Vashon Island. She becomes one of the largest landholders on Vashon Island. She helps finance her son's involvement with ferries, with mosquito fleet boats on the Covos Passage, which go bankrupt. Bankrupt her, bankrupt their sons. She's forced to move off the island. She moves to Everett, where she spends the rest of her life, and dies a widow in Everett. But when you take these three stories, you have that very, very sort of complete picture of what defines many people on Vashon today. Some come here and have very workaday lives. Some come here with money and can establish themselves on the island, and others come to the island and after a few years figure it out, it's just not for me, and they leave. And so this pattern is established very early, I think, with these three. And then we move into modernization. And here, if you look at this 1910 figure, you get that tremendous growth, and that's because of the railroads. The railroads are bringing people here. Puget Sound, what we call the Salish Sea, is being advertised around the nation, around the world. And so what you see is substantial population growth in that 1900 to 1910 period. It slows a little bit in in the 1920s because by 1920, because of World War I, it actually declines in the 1920s because there's an agricultural depression. And it only recovers at the very end of the 1930s as the Salish Sea region begins to build up its industries for World War II. So as you look at this period from the 1900s to the 1940s, there's really some significant transformations that take place. First, Vashon changes its focus from Tacoma to Seattle. And of course, that bypasses Burton. Burton was the gateway to Tacoma, as Seattle emerges as an important commercial center in the Northwest. What happens is all of a sudden Vashon town becomes the commercial center, and Burton just begins to sort of fade into what it has been for the last 60, 70 years, a beautiful community, but not a dynamic sort of commercial center. The change in the economy is a move from all the natural resource extraction to agriculture. Fishing peaks in Puget Sound in 1914. The major logging of the island is over by 1915. And brick making is replaced by brick makers on the mainland who can begin to transport their bricks much more easily than the Vashon brick makers. And so that economy changes. And this also becomes a period of consolidations. And I'll come back to that in a bit. The other significant thing, I think, is at the beginning of this period, in the 1900s, all the ferries are privately owned. By the 1950s, all the ferries are publicly owned, basically the Washington State ferry system. Vashon begins to change from solidly sort of middle West Republican voting to voting for Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. And we begin to see ourselves as a unified island, an island community rather than separate communities sort of scattered around the island. And so I have these two pictures of Vashon in 1915 and 1914. One, just the 1915 photo is of King County Council coming out to look at Vashon roads and sort of a push by islanders to get better roads. The 1940s photograph is, I want you to look at what we call the telephone poles, or actually power poles. And what you see in 1915 is the very beginnings of electricity on the island. By the 1940s, power poles are everywhere and they're loaded with power lines. Take some time and go uptown and look at those. Those poles are still there for the most part, but those sort of multitude of cables have been replaced by sort of banded cables are bundled cables. And so you still have the dependence on electricity, but it has shifted. And then, of course, the telephone begins to interconnect the island, and radio connects the island to the outside world in a much more immediate sense. And this is the consolidation. And I've just taken a few things here, but if you look at these maps, you know, at the beginning of this period, there's 30 some ferry docks around the island. By the 1950s, there's 2. You know, in 1900, there's community stores all over the island. You know, by the 1950s, there's only a handful, and most of those are gone in the next, you know, in the next 10, 15 years, until where you just have, you have the Burton store, you have stores at Center, and you have stores at Vashon Town. You look at schools. Every child that was within walking distance of the school. By the 1950s, Vashon has a unified school district, and there's basically 3 schools, you know, Burton Elementary, Vashon Elementary, Vashon High School, and then in the 1970s, McMurray, late 60s, early 70s, McMurray is built. But you see that change in transformation. And then post offices, of course, you know, every community had its post office, you know, by the 1940s, 1950s, it's down to 4, and now we're down to 1. And so that period of consolidation from 1900 to 1940 is very significant. And then this sort of idea of an island identity. And I'd like to look at Oliver Van der Linde's book, The History of Vashon Maury Island, 1935. It's the first time that people look at themselves as a unified whole. And George McCormick's Hike Around the Island in 1938 is just one of those kind of quirky, but I think influential points in time in which you can see this is him beginning his walk. The whole crowd showed up. And when you read the reports of it, every place he went around the island, people were there to cheer him on. People were there to sort of help give him some food, you know, help him rest and put on dry socks, whatever he needed. And so it became a community sort of event. And again, it helped to pull the island together, to see the island as one whole, rather than as these separate communities scattered around the water. Now, the next turning point, of course, is World War II. And what I think is significant about the war is significant, but it's the impact of the war in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that really changed Vashon Island. It turns Vashon into a suburban community, if you will. And you see that rapid growth in the late 1940s, and then in the 1960s, 50s and 1960s, you know, the drop in the 1970s with the Boeing bus. But the island's growing 38, 21, 26%. Those are big growth rates, particularly when you compare them with where we are today. Now, the transformations during this time, of course, the World War II and the exile and imprisonment of Japanese Americans, only about a third return. That destroys a very vibrant Japanese American community on the island. And it's only recently that the Japanese American community is beginning to pull together again. And the Friends of Mukai and restoring the Mukai farm and garden is an important part of that. And the joy and heartache exhibit that we did at the museum, you know, 5-6 years ago now, was an important part of sort of reuniting that Japanese American community. The other thing is the ferries. I mean, Vashon, after World War II, it's fed up with ferry strikes and with private ownership of ferries. So we form our own ferry district, which becomes in many ways the model for the Washington State ferry system in the early 1950s. And then the ferries have a huge impact at the end of this period in the 1980s that I'll come back and talk about. This is also a time in which a sort of new mindset comes to the island, a sort of more professional, rational planning sort of mindset. And what you get is the jigsaw planning process, and you get the emergence of Vashon Allied Arts and an arts community that begins to become a very important base on Vashon Island. And then, of course, you have the Cold War and the Nike base, which is only here for about 25 years, but brings a significant new population to the island. And then the island begins to shift away from agriculture. Agriculture begins to die out on the island in the 1950s and 60s. K2 and other manufacturers begin to emerge, and a new group of commuters commuting to off-island jobs comes to the island. And it's largely a human resource-based commuter. One of the big exports of Vashon becomes human knowledge. And then also Vashon goes back to being Republican. That's sort of Dwight D. Eisenhower Republicanism in the 1950s and 60s. And only by the 1970s and 80s begins to shift to Democratic, and then becomes much more intensively Democratic in the period after the 1980s. So Vashon takes charge. I mean, the Vashon Ferry District, this is the Lincoln, which was taken out of service when the Lake Washington Bridge opened up, and the ferries on Lake Washington were largely discontinued. It was a King County ferry. King County leased it to the Vashon Ferry District at a very reasonable rate, and Vashon ran their own ferries. The bridge was going to transform Vashon, and for a whole lot of reasons it failed, but it would have transformed Vashon in a way that many islanders today would not want to see. And the Operation Jigsaw, this sort of first community planning process on the island, and then the formation of Vashon Allied Arts. This is a great photograph taken by Terry Donnelly on the 40th anniversary. And these are all of the women artists who are heading the various parts of VAA, and that helped to grow into the organization it is today. And then the cultural change. The Nike base brings in a lot of young military personnel to the island, African Americans, Latino Americans, and it just brings change to the island. The baby boom, of course, brings schools, new elementary schools, new middle school. In the 1960s, a new high school. K2 becomes an important employer on the island. I just love this photograph. This was taken up on the Lander farm north of Vashon with the Olympic Mountains in the background. And it was this idea of the Vashon K2 factory in the fields on Vashon. The agricultural decline, strawberries are going out of business, basically strawberry farms. And so by the 1980s, the last major commercial strawberry picks take place, and Vashon begins to lose its agricultural base, which interestingly enough is starting to reemerge, but in a very different form. And of course, the hippies arrive. I mean, hippies is kind of a term that's broadly used. It's more a counterculture. New ideas, new people, a back to the earth movement, an environmental movement comes to the island, and they begin to bring change to the island. And of course, at the end of this period, what I like to call the quiet ferry revolution takes place. And it was quiet because, nobody sort of noticed it. And the ferry system didn't really trumpet it. I mean, people talked about it a bit, but when you look at 1980, we had a capacity of 239 cars to come to the island in the Quinault, the Klahani, the Klahoya, and the Hayu. By 1990, that's a 45% increase to 346 automobiles and a passenger-only ferry going right to downtown Seattle. That's why you see a tremendous population growth in the 1980s and 1990s on Vashon Island, because this ferry revolution took place and virtually nobody noticed it. Now, contemporary Vashon, this is a change from the 1980s to the present, and sort of gentrification begins in the 1990s. And if you look at this figure from 1980, this 1990 figure of 9,000 population, it's a 2,000, almost a 2,000 person increase in a 10-year period. That 1980 figure of 13% represents the period of the Boeing bust. But then After 1990, after the 1980s, population begins to slow. So the 2000 census reflecting the immigration to the island in the 1990s, 800, 9%, and then 5%, and then 4%. So that you can see Vashon is becoming gentrified. The population flow is slowing down, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There's lots of reasons for that. And Alice will come back next month and give us a very detailed picture of what's going on with the population on Vashon during this time period. So transformations, of course, gentrification, and which leads to cultural clashes, I'll talk about in a few minutes. It allows a very important artistic community to emerge on Vashon. It begins to emerge in the 1970s and 1980s, but by the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, it really comes into full blossom, if you will. And also an environmental consciousness on Vashon emerges. And Vashon becomes, face it, a gated community. And we begin to move from a resource economy, human resource economy, to a service economy. And we become what the Seattle Times likes to call ultra-liberal Vashon. We're not the most liberal community in the United States, but we're close. And then, of course, COVID. And COVID will have impacts that we can't quite see yet, but has a significant influence on the island. So let me take you through a few of these. So the cultural clashes, the Great Library War of 2008, when there was an attempt to move the library out of downtown Vashon down to the K2 site and develop that site. And it just turned into a major brouhaha. It never happened. And of course, the Vashon Fields in 2010, 2014, essentially bankrupted the Park District. And the Park District still recovering from that folly. And then the Vashon Center for the Arts, again, a very polarizing sort of a move by VAA to rename itself to build the Arts Center. And I love the Arts Centers. Many people on the island love the Arts Center. It's a great place to go for entertainment, but it created this schism, if you will, in the artistic community. And then Vashon Community Care becomes this great symbol for the island taking care of its own, with the Christmas miracle in the 1990s and the formation of Vashon Community Care. And then ultimately, and it's not just Vashon, but around the country and around the world, the failure of elderly care facilities, and Vashon hits that. And of course, seeing where that goes with the Indian Health Board will be a fascinating story for the future. Vashon, artistic Vashon emerges. And I mean, I just went in and just grabbed a few things. There are so many aspects to the arts on Vashon Island. It's hard to capture it all. And this is just a fraction of what's going on Vashon. There's virtually something every night. If you lived here in the 1970s or the 1950s or the 1930s, it was unusual to have a concert or have some kind of artistic event. They were very special. Now, I mean, virtually every night you can go anywhere on the island and there's something going on. And so it's been a very important shift in the focus of Vashon Island. And then environmental Vashon. And again, I just went in and grabbed a bunch. There's a lot more that are not here, but all of these organizations, from the very first environmental organization on the island, the Sportsman's Club, to the Land Trust and the Backbone Campaign and the Nature Center. And you can just see all of these things that are part of emphasizing the natural environment on Vashon Island and preserving it. And that has become a very important part of who we are. And then the fact that we are a gated community. And I just love this David Horsley cartoon in the Seattle Times, this sort of glug, 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 the ferry system going down the drain. And it has, I mean, benign neglect for 20 years, COVID and sort of staffing shortages has led us to a crisis in ferry transportation and has begun to limit what Vashon can become. And then housing prices and of course, the growth of very expensive estates on Vashon Island. But what I found interesting, I just went into, I think it was Redfin a couple days ago and just looked at the houses for sale on Vashon Island. Right now, and this changes daily, of course, but right now there were 14 houses for sale. 5 of them were under $1 million, most of them in the 700 to 900 range. 6 of them were in the $1 million to $4 million range, and 3 were in the $4 to $11 million range. That's significant in determining who can move to Vashon Island. And so the collapse of the ferry system, and of course the state's working to improve that and to change that, but we're stuck in this sort of failed ferry system for a number of years now, and we're stuck in this sort of rising property values and rising housing costs on the island that's putting pressure on everyone, and particularly putting pressure on those who support the community, who serve the community in service jobs. All you have to do is go to either the ferry docks in the morning and the afternoon and watch the number of trucks and service people leaving or coming onto the island to get a sense of how significant of change that is. And then, of course, COVID. COVID comes along in March 2020 and closes us down. And we were very lucky in many ways. And we were lucky because we had 2 organizations, the Medical Reserve Corps, which had been formed in 2002, and was basically an organization of medical professionals helping prepare the community for a natural disaster. And Vashon Be Prepared, which was formed in 2007 out of a coalition of groups. And really, both of these organizations were focusing on the large natural disaster that an earthquake, a major earthquake hitting the region would be. Well, COVID comes along in March of 2020, January, February, really, these guys are getting organized, and they pivot and begin to respond to COVID. And the response was amazing. I mean, Vashon has had 5 COVID deaths over the 3-year period. We've had very low infection rates compared to the rest of the county, the rest of the state, the rest of the nation. And it's largely because of the folks in the Medical Reserve Corps and Vashon Be Prepared and the Emergency Operations Center. So something Vashon can be very, very proud of. And then the question, of course, comes along of, you read in the Seattle Times and they talk about ultra-liberal Vashon. You know, it's a bit of a misnomer. You know, that 2015 article talking about Vashon being the most liberal small community in the United States, that was pretty quickly sort of debunked by Peter Reinerson and others. But at the same time, Vashon has become what the Seattle Times calls ultra-liberal. And all you have to do is look at the 2020 election. You know, 87.5% vote for Biden, 10% for Trump, 2% for others ranging from extreme right to extreme left. But Vashon has consistently been a very liberal sort of community. And of course, that's reflected in things like the land acknowledgement movement to sort of recognize that this is the traditional land of the Shwabopsh people. This photograph from the 2020 Black Lives Matter by Terry Donnelly. Vashon is very concerned and very involved politically with liberal causes. That's not to say there aren't people who are moderate and conservative on Vashon Island, but they're a small percentage of the population. And it's important to recognize that. And then finally, the question is, what will the new normal be? Will we go back to strawberry festivals where the Portage Phil plays on Main Street and people are dancing in the streets? Or will COVID have changed that? And I don't really have answers for what we will become. But I think if you understand where we have been, you may have a better sense of where we are going. So with that, I'll bring this to a close and open it up to questions. And thank you very much for taking the time to sort of wander through my mind with me and through the design of the new Vashon Heritage Museum permanent exhibit and how we want to look at Vashon history. So Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
Sure.
I mean, an interesting question here. What is the percentage of summer-only inhabitants, with the idea being the census typically taking place in the spring? Does that affect that number at all?
It does, and it's a very, and that's a good question for next month for Alice Larson, because we've looked a lot to try and capture that, and the Census Bureau has, and King County has, and it's very difficult to get at because, again, many of the summer residents fill out their census forms for where they reside full time, not for the island. You do get some with census data. You do get some unoccupied house sort of information. But at the same time, it's very difficult to know if that's a rental unit, if that's a summer house, if it's an Airbnb, I mean, it's just a very difficult question to answer, but it is a question. In the 1960s, 1970s, the population of the island would almost double in the summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, today that doesn't happen, I don't think.
Sure. Can you give us a sense of, have the Schwabops returned to the island at all? Do we have any currently here that residing?
Yeah, we're working through the 2020 census data, and that will give us some information. The 2010 census data, and it's another good question for Alice Larson. But yeah, in the 2010 census data, out of all the Native people who all the people on Vashon who identified as Native American, only 2 were Coast Salish. So the remainder, and I think the number was in the 140, 160 range. Others are from Alaska natives, from Eastern Washington, from California, from the Midwest. A variety of Native people live on Vashon Island. But a relatively small number are traditionally Schwabops Native people.
Okay, Bruce, we have a question here. Someone has some old photos of Vashon when their grandpa, Schaefer's family, lived in Dilworth.
Oh, wow.
My grandparents met on Vashon. So what could someone do with that? Could they show them to you, or is that a donated thing? Or
well, the best thing to do is to get hold of the Heritage Museum, and Laurie Tucker is the head of collections. And what we often do is we'll set up a time to meet with somebody, have them bring their photographs in. We'll have people from collections meet with them, look at the photographs, go over the photographs, basically decide whether people want to donate the photographs, whether they want to allow us to make duplicates or scans of the photographs, so they keep the photographs, but we also get copies of them. It can work in a variety of ways, but just get hold of the Vashon Heritage Museum. You can go to the website. There's a contact form on there, and just let the museum let us know that you have artifacts or photographs that you're interested in sharing. And we just love to build the collection with new photographs.
Okay, next question here. Are there any diaries or other first-person accounts of what daily life was like on the island in the 19th century and early 20th century?
There are, yeah, and that's another thing, to visit the museum, visit the research room. Bill Rendell, who was an early resident of Vashon Maury Island, wrote a wonderful journal about his time on Vashon, and he first came to Vashon in the 1890s. He was here until he died, I think, in the 1950s. But the Bill Rendell journals, there's a number of journals all the way up to sort of modern 1960s, 1970s. But 19th century, there's a fair number of journals and letters and things like that in the museum collection that people can come in and read.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Can you talk about Carlton and Barry's finding in their 1857 survey of the island? And is there a copy of their survey log available at the museum?
I believe there is, yeah. 1857 was the first survey of the island, and Carlton and Barry were the surveyors. And they surveyed basically the Washington Territory at the time. They surveyed it under the auspices of the Northwest Ordinance, which was an act passed in the 1790s, basically to provide a roadmap to statehood for the old Northwest Territory, which was basically Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, that area. And what it did is it provided for first doing a survey, and the survey laid out a prime meridian probably heard of Meridian Avenue in Kent and Auburn and places like that. That was a meridian established in the Salish Sea area. And then the survey basically laid out square mile blocks east and west of that, and then north and south. And so if you go to your property description, if you own property on Vashon, you will actually find that you're in section so-and-so and block so-and-so, and they can come down to the exact corners of your property. And that's all based on that 1857 survey. The other thing they did that was fascinating is they made detailed notes of each section. So each square mile, they made detailed notes, and they identified what they called witness trees. So trees that were established, well-established old trees that had essentially witnessed the natural history of that area. And Bianca Perla is a good person to contact, the Vashon Nature Center. There's a fellow up in the Gulf Islands, I think, who has done a book about the witness trees in the Puget Sound and Salish Sea area. And the survey, I think the Carlton and Berry survey is available at the museum. It's probably available online as well through the U.S. Geologic Survey.
Okay. Bruce, what prompted the filling in of the channel between Vashon and Maury Islands?
The good old portage question. Portage was indeed a portage. I mentioned Bill Rendell. He talks about as a young boy walking across there with water up to his armpits, slogging through the mud. So at a high tide, there would have been a substantial water flow through there, enough to move canoes and small boats through it. But basically, the first recorded evidence that I could find comes from the journals of one of the daughters of the Manson family who lived in Docton. And she talked about her father sending a crew in 1897 to build a causeway across Portage. So that's the first evidence we have of road building across Portage and beginning to sort of seal it off. And of course, they put culverts and things like that under it. And originally there were some bridges across Portage. The real sort of demise of Portage as an open area comes with the opening of the 1916 ferry dock at Portage, which was basically close to the site of where the fishing pier, the Tramp Harbor fishing pier is. And with that, they built the road from Portage to Ellisport along the water. And they actually began to close off the Tramp Harbor side of Portage. They had a bridge at one end that ultimately was replaced with a culvert. So over a period of time from the late 1890s into the 1910s, and then in the 1920s and 30s, and then finally in the 1960s, as they were paving most of the roads on Vashon Island, they used Portage as a dump for a lot of the refuse from the old road building. And so they filled in a lot of Portage, particularly that sort of southwest portion of Portage was filled in with dump materials from road building in the 1960s. So it's a long and interesting history.
I have a listener here. It says, as a child, they found a train engine just north of Docton Park. Was there a railroad line on the island at some point?
There actually was. The engine was called Loki, and it was basically owned by the Steen mill. So Herod Steen had a sawmill on Cove Road, and he had a narrow gauge logging railroad that he would run down past Fisher Pond and into that area over to where the Vashon Fields are and the Harbor School, up into Shingle Mill Creek. Yes, there was a railroad, steam railroad on the island, a small engine called Loki, not a big, powerful, steam engine by any means, but a logging railroad. And we do have photographs of that logging railroad and of Loki. But yeah, a number of people find evidence of tracks on the island. And sometimes they were railroad tracks. Other times, a lot along the waterfront, they would have been tracks used to move bricks And so they weren't actually steam engine tracks, but they were mining tracks, if you will, like in a mine, where people would push carts filled with bricks along the waterfront to load them onto boats. So, yeah, so there was a railroad.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had no idea. That seems to be the last question so far. Unless we have somebody else. Is there anything
Oh,
you'd like
great.
to add, Bruce?
No, I just let me emphasize what I've done tonight is I've tried to give you an overview of what we're doing with the permanent exhibit at the museum and how we're trying to organize it. And we would just love to get feedback from the community. If any of you have some interest in sort of seeing what we're doing, helping us to read and edit and reconceptualize what we're doing, we're totally open to having people get involved in any way that you want. So I see Elsa has come back on screen. Elsa, you can give them the contact information and encourage them to get hold of us and help us to really define this new exhibit. So
Absolutely.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bruce. This was fascinating. Always fascinating to hear the history of Vashon from you. Again, everyone, please join us in July 13th when Alice Larson talks and presents on demographics and a picture of us. And as Bruce said, we're very interested right now in having people's feedbacks and involvement in the permanent exhibit. The permanent exhibit is a very big initiative for the museum right now. And we'd be happy to have you be involved. Just you can go to our website and contact us through the website, or admin, send an email to admin@vashonheritage.org, and we'd love to talk to you. Thank you. Good night, everybody.